that allowed Theodore Roosevelt, then Secretary of the Navy, to start a war he had already prepared to the smallest detail. Only in 1980, almost a century later, would America recognize that the Spanish were not responsible for the attack. In order not to accuse themselves, however, the United States declared that the Maine was sunk because some explosives had been stacked too close to the steam room. In the meantime, the entire Spanish Armada had been wiped out, and America had become the new maritime power, with strategic positions going from the Caribbean to the Philippine Islands. In 1915, it was the sinking of the USS Lusitania by a German submarine to trigger the crisis that would eventually bring the United States into the First World War. It appears, however, that the U.S. had secretly slipped to the Germans the information that the ship was carrying a special cargo of weapons headed to England. This provoked the reaction from the German submarine, which sunk the vessel on which more than 100 Americans were also traveling. In 1941, it was the infamous Pearl Harbor attack to generate a wave of indignation large enough for President Roosevelt to declare war on Japan.
The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Almost 3,000 sailors died in the surprise attack. History would later reveal that the administration knew of the attack in advance, but it did everything possible to delay the transfer of information to the Hawaiian port. This was confirmed by Admiral Kimmel, the port's commander who helplessly witnessed the massacre of his crews and the destruction of his vessels.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
In 1964, the United States decided to officially declare war on North Vietnam. The war pretext came from the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident, in which North Vietnamese boats were accused of having launched torpedoes against the American destroyer Maddox. Then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately announced to the press the upcoming military action.
Immediately following the attack, U.S. representatives in Saigon met with representatives of the South Vietnamese government. They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required. The President's approval of this action.
But McNamara, 40 years later, would openly confess that the attack on the Maddox never took place.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
In the meantime, more than 60,000 U.S. soldiers and over 3 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives. In 1990, the situation between the United States and Iraq had grown tense, and the group of neoconservatives around President Bush convinced him it was time to attack Saddam Hussein. The U.S. secretly informed Saddam that they had nothing against him taking over the oil fields of Kuwait, a territory the Iraqi dictator had always claimed as his own. Saddam took the bait, and Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Tonight, the first pictures of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
At that point, Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, gave Saudi Arabia some satellite photos in which 250,000 Iraqi soldiers could be seen amassing behind the Kuwaiti border. Fearing an invasion, the Saudis granted the U.S. the extraordinary permission to establish military bases on the territory. At At the same time, the worldwide media launched a heavy campaign against Saddam, who was accused of having used lethal gas against his own people. No mention was made to the fact that the gas had been sold to Saddam by the United States, which then stood silent during the massacre, even though they were perfectly aware of it. The media campaign against the Iraqi dictator reached its peak with this touching testimony from a young Kuwaiti nurse who described to the world the atrocities committed by the Iraqi soldiers in her invaded country.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The news shocked the entire world, and from that moment no one had a word to say about the American bombing of Iraq. Ten years later, some journalists stumbled onto a set of satellite photographs taken by the Russians over the same desert in the same days.
It's what it didn't show that was more important. What you would have expected to have seen were tanks on the border. There were none that could be seen. There was nothing behind the border that could have supported that kind of number of troops and tanks.
The same pictures that showed the Iraqi tanks in Kuwait City also showed that there was absolutely nothing behind the Saudi border. Not a tank, not a vehicle, not a single man. At the same time, the nurse who had brought to tears the entire world turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. She had faked the entire incubator story after having been professionally trained by one of the most important advertising agencies in Washington, Hill and Knowlton. In the meantime, the U.S. had wiped out the entire Iraqi army and had managed to establish permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. In a cruel and ruthless shooting spree, and against all international treaties, the U.S. Air Forces literally destroyed and turned to ashes thousands of Iraqi soldiers on their way back to Baghdad. Before taking this picture, the photographer wrote on the side of the tank, "If I don't photograph this, people like my mom will think that war is what they see on TV." Besides the historic cases, there are also many plans of deception that, for one reason or another, were never used in the real world. One of them is called Operation Northwoods, a 1962 CIA secret plan that was declassified a few years ago. At that time, the United States was trying to regain control of Cuba, which had been lost to Fidel Castro's revolution 3 years before. Under the subject Justifications for a Military Intervention in Cuba, we can read the following proposals. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, unmanned vessel anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of a Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The U.S. could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualties lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even Washington. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees even to the extent of wounding, in instances to be widely publicized. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. And then there was this interesting idea. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area.